Okay, I'm going to run through an adaptation of the say it then play it system of note recognition. I worked this out for piano. A few people I spoke to thought, said to me, like, the feedback that I got was, oh, well, that's well and good for piano, but it wouldn't work for guitar. I don't play guitar, so I've started teaching myself to read guitar music using a similar interval-based note recognition method. So where I've gotten to so far with it is this. There are a few things that you need to be able to do. The first is look at a note and, in the absence of any other information, find out where to play it on the guitar. To do that, the simplest thing to do is to learn the open note positions. So just learn your EAD, EADGBE, so that you can see those things on the stave and know which of these open strings to play. Then you need to know how the lines and spaces move in the key that you're playing in on the guitar. Now we'll just consider C major for the moment, which is the white notes on the piano. So on the piano, you can look at a piece of music in C major, find a note, and then say, okay, the note's on a space. The note that I want to go to is 2 lines above the space. And then you can count up the piano. Space, line, space, line, space. And so if you do that a few times, you know, like for a few weeks, you practice and practice it, you just get to the point where you can recognize the intervals really quickly on the piano. The trouble with the guitar is that because the frets are chromatic and some white notes are semitone movements and some white notes are whole tone movements. So you can't uniformly, for every string on the guitar, say, okay, I'm starting from an open E and I want to go 2 spaces above. That's going to be different from going up 2 spaces from an open B string, for example. But fortunately, it's not actually that hard to learn how the lines and spaces move on the guitar. And in fact, when you're playing in any key other than C major on the piano, it's kind of the same anyway. You sort of have to learn where all the stuff is on the instrument, where all the notes, sharps and flats are for a given scale. The difference is that with the piano you kind of get C major for free. But this is what C major looks like on the guitar. Okay? Frets are going up here, and each of these crosses and dots is a note that exists in that scale. I've marked with a dot where there's been a semitone note movement. And if you start to play this, you notice that there's only a few kind of patterns that it uses. So on the E string, for example, we've got open E. The first white note movement up is to the F, so it's 1 semitone up, right? So first fret. Then you skip a fret, and then skip one, another semitone, skip, skip. For the A string, you skip the first fret, then there's a semitone movement, which is the B to the C. You skip, skip, semitone, skip, skip. And so on and so forth. So I practice them 0 to 5 frets, and then 6 to 10. And if you do them separately like that, they're actually, you kind of get them in about a day. You can start to get the feel for a given key. So I started with C major, and I practiced the first 5 frets. And then you can go up to the next set of frets. Sorry, that should have been. So that's after about a day. I've been able to get the feel for the shapes for C major. I also noticed that there's only actually 3 shapes that are repeated over and over. Either it's open to skip, skip, right? So frets kind of like in an evenly spaced group of 3 like that. Or they are skip, on, on, or they go on, skip. And so those are the 3 patterns. So E is pattern 1, the 3 skips, then on, skip, on, skip, on, skip, on. And so on. So anyway, you can play around with that. And what that does is it allows you to say, okay, if I'm on it, if the note on the, so I've got this sheet here that I'm learning, Santa Claus is coming to town. And if I look at this note, this starting note here, that's 1 space above the open E string. And 1 space above a space means that I have to move up 2 white notes. So if I start with my open E string, and I know that from my scale pattern, that to move up 2 notes on the open E string, I go, right, so that note there is there. And the top note here is my open B string. So it's pretty easy for me to start this tune, because it's just this. Then the next note in the song is 1 space above that open B string. Now my B string here, you can see that it gets this first frets turned on. Yep. And then it walks up 1 more space, and then I've got the open D string at the bottom. So my B string goes on, skip, on, and open D. Okay. So you can go through pretty easily doing interval movements and relative to open string positions. So that's the first thing. That's thing 1. Then thing 2 is when you need to play intervals. So here is this chord. By the way, this song is in the key of G major, which means that actually it's this chart here that has all the notes. Basically the F's just sharpened. But anyway, it's not actually that different, because this actually naturalizes the F anyway. So this here, this interval, you couldn't work out how to play this by going relative, like taking each note relative to an open string, because you would end up all over the fretboard. Like you couldn't physically create that chord shape with your hand. Which is actually why the guitar repeats so many notes. Like it would be impossible to do a chord if all the notes were sort of along 1 string, and if you only had 2 strings and a really long fretboard, you couldn't make any chords either. So all the notes start to repeat after the 5th fret, so that you can create chords. So if you need to make an interval and you don't have any other information, and the top note of the chord is above the stave, start from the top note. And this top note is, as you can see, is 2 lines above the open E string. So E is a space, line, space, line. So that's my 5th fret. And the next note down from that is a line below it. Now here's where it gets a bit tricky. So bear with me on this one. The interval between the open strings goes 4th, 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 3rd, 4th. That's why you've got this okay. So bearing that in mind, if you need to go down a 4th, and a 4th in terms of white note, in terms of line, space, lines moves, would be 2 spaces below a line or 2 lines below a space. So on the piano that would be like you're playing a note, you skip 2 notes and you play another note. That would be space, line, space, line. So 2 lines above a space, or line, space, line, space. Okay. So if you need to play, if you're on the 5th fret and you need to go down a 4th, all you do is you play the same fret on the note on the string below. Now on the 5th fret in my C major chart, and also in the G major chart below it, all the frets have a cross on them, which means that when I start on the 5th fret, those 2 notes both exist in the C major scale. If I need to go down a 3rd though, I can do it by saying, okay, well I've got to go down a 4th, and then I've got to make this note, the bottom note, 1 white note movement higher. So as I move this way up the fretboard, I make this string closer to this string. So to get to a 4th, I go, to get to a 3rd, I go down a 4th and up 1 white note. So on my, you can see here, if I go down, then the next white note movement here on the C major scale is in the 6th fret, but in the G major scale, because it's an F sharp, it's actually a skip. So in the key of G sharp, if I want to go down a 3rd from my 5th fret on my E string, I do that shape there, right? Go down a 4th, and move that string along 1. In actual fact, this naturalizes the F anyway, so I don't know why they bothered putting it in the key of G major, but every time there's an F that I can see, it calls it a natural. So actually, it's down there, and move the string up 1. So that's my 3rd. And then the next interval, as you can see, is that 4th. So I've got a line and then 2 spaces below it. So all I have to do that is go down to the same fret on the string below. But that note doesn't exist in this scale. See? So, in order to go down to a note that doesn't exist, when it's a 4th, you lengthen it. The only time that happens is when you go from a B to an F. Because on the piano, between B and F is actually 5 semitones, even though on the stave it's the same number of lines and spaces than, for example, between G and C. So when you are going down by a 4th and the note below it doesn't exist in the scale that you're doing, lengthen the interval. The opposite is true for the 3rd interval. So if you're on the B string and you want to go down to the next fret and the note doesn't exist, you bump it up. You shorten it, the interval. So, 5th fret, want to go down to my 3rd, then want to go down a 4th, that string doesn't exist, so I lengthen it, and I end up with this little shape here, and then I've just got the open D string at the bottom there. Now, if you look at the tab, I've correctly identified the correct place to play that chord on the fretboard. So that's how you can check. Like when you're doing this, you're sort of building up an intuition about where you should play things on the fretboard, and you can check it against the tab until you're experienced. It also tells me that it wants me to play, instead of an open D, it actually wants me to play the 5th fret on the A string. I think that's so that it doesn't keep vibrating after I take the chord off, because the note doesn't hold. So reading the rhythm and knowing which strings to keep open or not is probably going to be a bit more advanced. At the moment I'm just focusing on note recognition. Okay, so that's finding intervals. Now thing 3 that you want to be able to do is to then determine from here, for the next chord, where should I play the next chord without looking at the tabs, right? So here we've got the top note moves down by 1 movement, so from a line to a space. And so your first instinct is, well, okay, well, I was on the 5th fret with on top note before, and I'll just go down 1 white note movement. But that's actually not the best way to make that movement. The reason for that is actually that if you go through the process of doing it, you can try it out, you just end up in this really awkward position, especially when you get to the next chord after that, right? You just end up in this weird place, and you got like an open string here, and you're having to do this weird thing, and it just turns out that it's a bad way to go. But how would you know that ahead of time? Like, that's the challenge, is how would you know, without having experimented with that specific arrangement before? Like, if your goal is to be able to sight read, how would you know in real time which direction to go in with that? Because instead of going down there to make a white note movement, you can go down the 4th and then to above, right? It's the same note. Oops. Okay, so just as easy to do in terms of thinking about the interval, but that movement keeps you in the same area of the fretboard. So what you want to do is, if you're doing these kind of like stepwise movements, just try to stay in the same kind of region. So in between the 5th and 10th fret, in between the 10th and 15th frets, or whatever, and in between the 1st and the 5th. So if you're kind of over here, try and stay over there. If you're kind of in the middle, try and stay in the middle. And if you think about it like that, when you need to make that stepwise movement, it becomes obvious that you don't want to go down into here. You kind of want to keep it in this middle zone. And then the process of constructing that chord down from this note is pretty trivial. You've got a 5th. Now, because this interval here is a 3rd, to get to our 5th, we go down to the next fret, and I can see that that note doesn't exist there, so I go to the next one up, and then because to get from a 3rd to a 5th, I go down by 2 white notes, 1, 2. So that's the 5th, and then it's a 3rd down from there. So a 3rd down from this note is going to be down to the next fret, which is the 4th, and then move up by 1 white note. And what happens then is that on the next chord, see there's another stepwise motion. So if I said, oh, okay, well that movement, I went down to the next string, so maybe I should do the same thing again, right? I'll go down here. But that takes me outside of the zone again. So because I would be traveling too far up the fretboard then, I know that when I do this stepwise motion, I actually just want to move back one white note. So you kind of zigzag back and forth, keeping in the same region of the fretboard as a sort of rule. So that's it. That's the say it then play it method adapted for guitar. Find it, if you, in the absence of any other information, just find a note relative to an open position string. Learn the pattern of how the strings work for the key that you're in. You don't have to learn all the keys at once. You can just learn the keys that you need for a particular piece. As you're training yourself up, eventually you'll just know a bunch of keys. The patterns themselves I find useful to practice in groups of 5 frets. Sort of chunk it out and remember them individually. That'll give you the ability to look at a note and get to a note based on one of the open strings. Then use the intervals between the strings, 4th, 3rd, 4th, 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 to do your chord construction. And when you're moving from one chord to another, try to keep in the same area of the fretboard and move vertically as much as possible, like zigzag back and forth. Don't travel in long movements and long distances up and down the fretboard. And with those 3 kind of basic rules or basic tenets of sight reading, I've found that going through this piece as an exercise, I've been able to apply those rules, and the notes that I've determined through those exercises have been correct according to the tab that's below it. So I am still practicing. I only just started doing this. I will report back with progress. I think that after a few months of doing that practice, I'll be able to read notes on the guitar about as quickly as I can on the piano now, after practicing it for a few months. But it remains to be seen. And if anyone else gives it a try, I would love to hear your feedback and any input you might have. As I said, I don't play guitar, but I'm just sort of trying to figure out a good method of interval-based note reading. All right, thanks, bye.